Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're going to trace a single really powerful idea through 500 years of global history. It's all based on a source that argues the world works very, very differently than we're often told. It's a story about a hidden pattern of power, and we are going to follow that thread from the Age of Conquest all the way up to today. So let's start with the source's core idea, which is pretty provocative. It basically challenges that familiar story we all know, the one about progress and innovation. It argues that the real engine of the modern world wasn't just invention, but a system of extraction and control that was set up centuries ago, and, it argues, continues to shape our world right now. So to really get this argument, where do we even begin? Well, the analysis takes us way back, 500 years, to what it calls the original blueprint, the moment this entire pattern of power was first sketched out. Okay, and the whole argument, the entire thing, hinges on this one key concept, the comprador elite. You can think of them as the local managers for foreign interests. Their real loyalty isn't to their own people or their own nation, but to the outside power that guarantees their personal wealth and their position. This right here, this is the golden thread we're going to be following. And you have to understand, this pattern wasn't some kind of historical accident. Nope, it was a strategy, and it was refined over centuries. You see it from the very beginning with the Spanish conquests, to the British perfecting the art of ruling through local proxies, all the way to forcing China open with gunboats. The goal was always the same: get access and get the resources out. And what's so fascinating here is how you see the exact same job description in totally different empires. You've got the Spanish encomendero, who is given control over indigenous labor, basically a disguised form of slavery. And then, half a world away and centuries later, you have the British co-opting the Indian zamindar to enforce these incredibly brutal tax policies. Different masks, same exact job: manage the extraction for a foreign power. Okay, so what happens when the era of direct colonialism supposedly ends? Does this pattern just vanish? Well, according to this analysis, not even close. It just put on some new masks for the same old game. This was the Cold War pivot. This is a huge shift, right? The entire justification for getting involved in another country's business completely changed. The enemy wasn't some other empire anymore. No, the enemy was now internal. It was the subversive, communists, nationalists, anyone who might get in the way of foreign corporate or political interests. So a whole new playbook gets written. Forget the old colonial administrators. Now you have agencies like the CIA, training, funding, and arming local militaries. And these forces were basically taught to see their own democratically elected governments as the main threat. And this led to this just huge wave of military coups that swept across the global south. And Mobutu in Zaire, wow, he is just the textbook example of this new kind of collaborator, the military dictator. He made sure his country stayed aligned with the West, he gave them a base for anti-communist operations, and in return, he was given a free pass to steal billions from his own nation, all while his power was propped up by foreign support. Okay, so let's fast forward to our time. The analysis argues that the playbook has morphed yet again. Open military coups are a bit messy, a bit obvious. The new tools are way more subtle. The game has shifted from coups to contracts. The new collaborator is often the technocrat, the finance minister who went to school in the West and comes back home to implement economic policies that were designed in Washington. The promise always sounded great: free markets, growth, stability. But the source argues the reality, in places from Argentina to Egypt, was a fire sale of state assets, crushing austerity for the poor, and the destruction of local industries. And the weapons themselves have gotten a serious upgrade. You have lawfare, which turns the legal system itself into a political weapon. You have the war on terror, which gives this sort of open-ended permission slip for intervention. And now we're seeing these new frontiers opening up, what the source calls digital and green colonialism, where control over a country's data or its climate policy becomes the new resource to be extracted. And the price tag for these modern strategies? It is just staggering. The Cost of War project over at Brown University estimates that the post-9/11 wars have cost U.S. taxpayers more than $8 trillion. And that number just keeps going up. But here's where the story gets really interesting. After 5 centuries of this same basic pattern playing out over and over, the source argues we are finally seeing a real structural challenge to this whole system. And it's not coming from the West. It's coming from the global South itself.
And this is a really important distinction to make. The goal here isn't necessarily to be anti-West or to tear everything down. It's about being non-West centric. It's about building parallel systems, creating a world with more than one center of gravity, a world where countries actually have other options besides the traditional Western-led institutions.
And you can see this happening right now with groups like the expanded BRICS Plus bloc. They've built their own institutions, like the New Development Bank, and it runs on a totally different philosophy. It's one country, one vote, not $1, one vote, like you see at the IMF. It offers development loans without demanding these painful austerity policies in return, and it's pushing for trade in local currencies to get around the US dollar. All right, so let's just step back for a second. When you put all these pieces together, side by side, what does this 500-year story of power actually look like? How does it all connect?
And this slide right here basically crystallizes the source's entire argument. Look at the progression. You go from the colonial administrator to the Cold War dictator to the modern technocrat. The profile of that local elite changes. The imperial mechanism evolves from the sword to the coup to the loan agreement. But the function they perform, facilitating the transfer of wealth and sovereignty and the consequences for their own people, those have remained tragically consistent. So this analysis really leaves us with a huge question, right? The big question for our time. As new powers rise, as institutions like BRICS create real alternatives, are we finally watching this 500-year pattern break apart for good? Or are we just watching the opening moves of its next and maybe even more complex chapter?